Hey guys, so today we're going to be talking about diabetic ketoacidosis, also known as DKA, and its mechanisms for blood acidification, as well as its implications with human health. So first of all, what is diabetic ketoacidosis? It occurs when someone that is diabetic has gone without insulin for a prolonged period of time. So we know the different types of diabetes. Some people just can't produce insulin at all. Some people don't produce it in high enough quantities, and that's why they need those insulin supplements. Other people, their insulin receptors don't function properly with insulin. Therefore, they are still unable to intake glucose even in the presence of insulin. So when glucose is unable to enter cells, the body experiences what's called hyperglycemia, or a heightened concentration of glucose in the blood. So it's interesting that high concentrations of glucose can actually acidify blood, but we're not going to be talking about that today. So when cells aren't able to take up glucose from the blood, the body has to use a different carbon source for energy. So instead of glucose, the body dips into its fatty acid reserves as a carbon source. So rapid metabolism, acute rapid metabolism of body fats can result in the buildup of ketone bodies in the bloodstream. And these ketones are what acidify the blood. So let's talk about what ketoacidosis actually means, right? So keto comes from, the basic ketones that we're talking about. It's talking about that chemical structure, because that is what is acidifying the blood. Now, acidosis is the acidification of something. In this case, like we said, blood, also known as serum. Okay, and these are the symptoms that can occur when ketoacidosis does happen. If left untreated for a prolonged period of time, it can result in organ failure, eventually death. Some people fall into a coma before then. But yeah, so just not good stuff for the body. So let's talk about ketosis versus ketoacidosis. So you may have heard of ketosis before from the keto diet or the ketogenic diet, and that's where it gets its name from, is from the ketones, right? It's not dangerous in that it's because it's characteristic of a very low carb diet, so the ketogenic diet, or a fasted state. And that has to do with the pH buffering capacities of our blood, and we'll talk about that later. So typically you'll still have normal blood sugar levels. It just might be like on the lower spectrum of normal, but not enough for it to be unhealthy. Blood pH is going to be still normal, 7.35 to 7.45. So in terms of the pH scale, right, we know that 7 is pure neutral, but our body functions the best at a slightly basic pH. So it isn't alkaline, but it's just slightly basic, so just above 7, right? Blood ketone levels is 1 to 8 millimoles per liter. Okay, so that's normal. It might be a little higher than if your body is not in ketosis, because your body isn't relying as much on bodily fats, right? And then blood bicarbonate levels is going to be 22 to 30 millimoles per liter, and then typically no symptoms. In ketoacidosis, however, it's basically a much more severe version of ketosis, to the point where it does become unhealthy. It's very dangerous. You can have 200 plus blood sugar level, and again, high concentrations of glucose in the blood can also contribute to acidosis. Blood pH is going to be less than 7.31, so well outside of that safe range. It's still slightly basic. It's important to remember that, but for our bodies, it's relatively too acidic to handle. Okay, so that's when we start seeing all those bad symptoms. Blood ketone levels is going to be 2 to 25 plus millimoles per liter, so much higher, okay, than in ketosis. And then blood bicarbonate levels is going to be less than 15 millimoles per liter. So bicarbonate, right, it's one of those buffering mechanisms that are present in our blood. Bicarbonate, it's, as the name suggests, it's going to be a type of ion. It's going to accept the free protons that are acidifying the blood. So when you have a higher concentration of free protons in the blood, then you're going to use up more of this bicarbonate. That's why you see this decrease in the blood bicarbonate levels. Okay, and again, symptoms that we discussed before will be present. So let's talk about these fatty acid metabolites, right? These are the three main metabolites of fatty acids. We call them ketone bodies, right? And so we have these three: acetoacetate, beta hydroxybutyric acid, and then acetone. Okay. So acetone, it's important to remember that it's going to be quickly swept up by the body. It's metabolized very quickly, and it's also expelled by the body through the breath because it has a very low volatility. So now let's talk about the different blood pH buffering mechanisms that exist in the body. There are loads more, but these are just some of them, and we're only going to be focusing on this one today. So acetic acid and acetate, right, is just going to be going through that equilibrium when there's more acid versus more base. And that is the main mechanism of blood pH buffering when it comes to ketoacidosis. Carbonic acid and carbonate. So this is really important when it comes to CO2 concentrations in our blood. As we know, carbon dioxide can acidify solutions, as we've seen. Greater greenhouse gas emissions, greater amounts of carbon dioxide. As it dissolves into the ocean, you see this bleaching of the coral reefs, and that's because of the higher pH in the ocean. A lot of crustaceans, a lot of shellfish, right, they can't form their calcified hard shells as well anymore because the ocean is becoming more acidic. Phosphate buffers, these are really important in microbiology and biology labs. And then proteins. So it's interesting that proteins can also act as a pH buffering mechanism, but it makes sense if you think about the structure. So proteins, the way that they form those polypeptides is they just acid-base react with one another in a repeating fashion, right? So this and this, they're going to acid-base react with one another. But when they're on their own, that's when they can act as a pH buffering mechanism, right? Because they have their basic region and they have their acidic region. So now let's talk about this type of equilibrium when it comes to blood pH buffering. So the red right here, it's going to be the acid. This purple right here is going to be the base. So when you have a higher concentration of free protons in solution or in serum, what's going to happen is more of this base is going to react with those free protons, generating a higher amount of this CH3COOH. Okay, this is acetic acid. As opposed to this acetate. So as this acetate is used up, acetic acid is the byproduct of that. Okay, and then the inverse is true when you have a higher concentration of hydroxide, right? So this guy is going to donate more of its acidic protons, right? This H at the end, in order to form water to neutralize this base. But in that process, more of this anion is going to be formed, right? Because this neutral species is used up, and the product of that is this anion. So now let's talk about equilibrium in terms of these ketone bodies. Okay, so I just redrew what was shown in here. So let's take a look at acetic acid. So this has a pKa of 3.59 versus acetic acid, right, which is what's going to be buffering this. Well, acetate is buffering this, and then acetic acid is the byproduct of that. So the pKa of this one is 4.76, and we know that equilibrium lies towards the right side because it falls towards the weaker acid, right? So because of this, we see deprotonation of the acetic acid to turn into acetoacetate, but then we have those free protons that are then taken up by the acetic acid. So we have this proton transfer. Okay. Let's talk about beta hydroxybutyric acid. So this one also has a lower pKa than this one. So equilibrium is going to fall towards the right. We do see deprotonation of this molecule. And then for acetone, equilibrium actually lies towards the left. So acetone kind of struggles to donate those protons. So as a result, we don't really see this side of the reaction as much. It falls towards the right side. So the towards the left side. Now let's go back to these two. When the buffering does occur, right, those free protons, right, are taken up by this guy. So this guy accepts it, turning into this. Same thing here. This guy accepts the proton that's donated by this, turning into acetic acid. So this mechanism helps restore our body's homeostasis in terms of pH. What becomes dangerous in ketoacidosis as opposed to ketosis is that ketosis, you still see these ketone bodies that are acidifying the blood, but it is within the pH buffering capacities of our blood. The difference between that and ketoacidosis is that acidification occurs to a much higher degree because you have these ketone bodies at a much higher concentration. So because of that, it exceeds the buffering capacities of our blood. So when you run out of acetate and you don't have any other bases to accept those free protons, then more of those free protons continue to build up into the bloodstream. And that is what causes ketoacidosis. That's why we have all of these symptoms that we referred to, right? So once you overcome that pKa buffering capacity of our blood, that's when you start hitting ketoacidosis. And if it's prolonged for a long enough time, then that's when you have severe health consequences. Even if you recover, your bodily tissues are damaged as a result of that acidification. Okay. So hopefully you learned something about diabetic ketoacidosis, how it functions, its implications with human health, and maybe this will interest you in looking into other topics. Thank you.